You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 8. I wish I could say I followed Dr. G's instructions and slept like a baby when I got home. But the fact is that what I'd heard that night made sleep virtually impossible. The gurgling, hacking, laughing river, and my helpless dog's whimpers echoed through my dreams so many times I barely felt as if I was going to sleep, so much as stepping from one reality to another every time I closed my eyes. A small mercy was that my fiancée had another late night studying, and so I did not have to cope with the guilt and shame over waking her with my constant screaming exits from rest. Eventually, desperate for sleep, I washed down a few anti-anxiety pills with a copious amount of wine, and somehow the combination of chemicals drove the nightmare away. However, the sound of the alarm, which rang seemingly the next second after I'd closed my eyes, only compounded the horrors of the previous night with a splitting headache. Still, a shower, an ibuprofen, and a small ocean of coffee later, I felt at least functional enough to drive. So it was that I dug my copy of Joe's file out from under the container of now stale fried rice I'd tried to scarf down the night previous, and looked at the first page to find his listed home address. The listed location instantly explained how Joe's family could afford 20 years of inpatient treatment for a seemingly incurable condition. It was located in a part of the state so infamous for its wealth that its very name conjured images of gold-plated cars, palatial homes, and family-owned yachts. What was more, a quick look at MapQuest showed that Joe's family home stood at the center of a vast estate bordering the water. Under any other circumstances, I'd have been at least a bit curious to see what such opulence looked like up close. But in this case, the only thing that struck me was how isolated the place was, and therefore how far from help anyone there must have been. The one mercy was that it was only about an hour and a half's drive from where I was, and would be shorter if traffic was light. So, laying the MapQuest directions on the passenger seat of my car for easy reference, I pulled on my doctor's uniform, entered my car, and began the drive out to find whatever might be waiting for me at the birthplace of Joe's insanity, if that was indeed what it was. If I believed that nature had a sense of irony, that drive would have been a strong bit of evidence to support me. The weather was the sort of cool autumn balm that one hopes and prays for every year. The traffic non-existent, and to top it off, my fiancée informed me that she would almost certainly be free for the rest of the evening once I returned, having just completed a very difficult exam for a course that would not capture her attention again for some months. In short, under any other circumstances, it would have been the perfect day, which made the drive into what I now regarded as some sort of secular equivalent of the mouth of hell that much more unnerving. The postcard picturesqueness of that part of the state where Joe's family lived only enhanced this feeling of cognitive dissonance. I must have driven past hundreds of expansive yet tasteful manses of the sort only old money could construct, each of which looked as if it belonged in a Jane Austen novel rather than the United States. The few residents I saw wandering about the streets seemed as if they'd been plucked from a Brooks Brothers or J Press magazine spread, each decked out in clothes worth several months of my salary, and watches that probably would have cost me my annual income at least. My relative modest, though well-kept Ford Taurus must have seemed conspicuously out of place alongside the armies of Mercedes, Audis, and Bentleys. This was the sort of place where pain of any kind was either flushed out with medication and trips to boutique psychiatrists, or simply kept at a respectable distance by copious expenditures. In short, it was a place where anything unpleasant let alone supernatural horror, had been ruthlessly gentrified out of sight and out of mind. It wasn't until I was pulling up to the thick, wrought iron gate of Joe's family estate that I felt any sense of ominousness in my surroundings, though in hindsight that may have partially been the result of being practically roared at to stop by a burly security guard who looked as if he belonged on a mission sponsored by Blackwater rather than guarding a quiet family home. Not wanting to seem unduly nervous, I explained in my best bedside manner that I was helping to treat the family's sick son at the mental hospital and was hoping to speak to them about his condition. The guard didn't seem mollified by this at first, but after some probing questions, all delivered in the same stentorian drill sergeant snarl, he finally spun around with military precision and dialed in a few numbers on his security council. A woman's voice, tinged with the sort of polite, clenched jaw accent that one usually only heard from elderly yacht club members, sounded from the microphone, and after some brief conversation with the martinet who'd just interrogated me, she agreed that I should be let in. The guard made no attempt at protest, but simply hung up smartly and pushed a button, causing the gate to swing open with almost perfect silence and smoothness. My stomach now churning with the nerves I'd been trying to suppress since setting out on the drive, I pulled my car through. The driveway to Joe's family home ran up a gradual, obsessively manicured hill, surrounded by a small forest of equally well-kept trees. At the top of the hill, surrounded by more such trees, stood the house itself. A towering Strawberry Hill-style house built with stone that seemed to transform the sun's rays into a radiant pastel glow. I pulled up in front and handing my keys to a stiff-necked valet, who looked pained to even set foot in a car as modest as mine, stepped out to go face whatever the house had in store for me. As I walked up the sparkling limestone stairs, the door opened and a wispy, middle-aged woman, whose face looked the picture of gracefully aged beauty, swept down to meet me. I must admit that my first thought upon meeting her was this was hardly the sort of person I could imagine conspiring to keep the sexual molestation of a child a secret, even out of denial. She had a kind air about her, but it was girded with such naturally aristocratic steel that I imagined she must have been born ringing a bell to summon servants. "Dr. H," she said in the same prep school inflected accent I'd heard over the intercom. "Such a pleasure to receive you." Dr. G called ahead to let me know you'd be coming today, and I must say I was relieved. I've been wondering ever so much about my poor Joseph, and haven't heard almost anything from the hospital, other than the bills, of course, so you can imagine my pleasure at your calling. Please do come in. "Thank you, Mrs. M," I said graciously, shaking her hand with what I had hoped was an appropriate professionalism. "I'm very glad to be able to have caught you at home. I was hoping to speak to at least one of Joe's parents." "Well, I'm afraid you'll have to make do with me," she said somewhat sadly. "Jess's father has been dead for the past 10 years. However, if I can be of help, I will be happy to. Just come into the sitting room and we'll talk." The sitting room was actually a high-vaulted chamber, copiously furnished with aged mahogany and cherry wood, with what looked to be a few genuine mounted animal heads. Unaccustomed to the trappings of such advanced wealth, I naturally found myself looking around with no small amount of wonder, when one particular mount made me jump back in shock and utter a small gasp. It was, to be blunt, not the head of anything I had ever seen or wished to see again. If I had found out it was genuine, I might have had nightmares for the rest of my life. Protruding from the plaque to which it was grafted, sketched a bulbous, almost shapeless head nearly a foot long, bearing a pair of massive, sickly yellow segmented eyes, and several rows of pinchers that looked like they must have once dripped with venom. Seeing my horror, Mrs. M followed my gaze and shuddered herself. "Awful thing, isn't it?" she asked. "I've never had the heart to take it down, though. Don't worry, it's only an artistic piece, nothing real. Charles, Joseph's father, was quite an accomplished hunter, and when Joseph's night terrors first started, he thought it might help him if we pretended he'd caught and killed the thing, and mounted its head in this room. We commissioned an artist to get a description of what it looked like from Joseph himself and to study his drawings, and that's what he produced." She sniffed bitterly. The hideous thing didn't reassure Joseph, of course. If anything, I suspect it scared him more. But since his long hospitalization, I've kept it here partially to remember how much Charles wanted to see Joseph cured, and partially as a sort of symbol of hope for me that one day Joseph might beat the mental illness that made him imagine the filthy thing in the first place. Still transfixed with disgust and fascination, it took quite a bit of effort to tear my eyes away from that monstrous depiction of a 6-year-old boogeyman. However, the mention of his night terrors did remind me of my purpose, and I turned to look at Joe's mother. "Mrs. M, it's actually Joe's night terrors that brought me here," I began, having practiced my lie several times in the car on the way. "Even though we've tried many courses of treatment with your son, we have begun to wonder if his more lasting psychosis might somehow be connected to his earlier night terrors. We never really explored them when he first came in, and perhaps there's something we would have learned if we had asked about them in the first place." And Joe's mother gave me a searching look, and for the first time it struck me that, despite her exceedingly polished appearance, she really looked quite anxious, even desperate for some good news. "Dr. H, firstly, call me Martha," she said. "If you are serious about trying to bring back my boy after all these years, then at the very least we should be on first-name terms. Secondly, I am glad you are exploring this particular line of questioning. I have often wondered if Joseph might have been spared whatever is wrong with him if we'd brought him in to see a doctor about his night terrors to begin with. So ask whatever you like. If I know the answer, I will give it to you." I nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Martha. Martha, can you tell me when Joseph's night terrors started?" Martha nodded. "About when he was 3, she said. We'd moved to this house and decided it was time for him to have his own room. I was pregnant with his little sister Eliza at the time, and while we could have knocked down a few walls and expanded the nursery, all of our friends told us that 3 was too old to still be sleeping in a room for babies. So we had a decorator come in and remodel one of the smaller attic rooms into the most charming little boy's room you can imagine, and put Joseph in there. He absolutely loved his new room when he first saw it, and his nanny practically had to drag him down to meals to get him to leave. But that night—" She swallowed hard and put up a hand. "If you don't mind, Dr. H, I think I'll pour myself a drink before we continue. Can I get you one as well?" "Parker, please," I said, and no thank you." She stood up and walked briskly to a hand-carved globe bar and poured a generous helping of amber liquid into a fine crystal glass, which she swirled for a few moments before taking the first sip. Apparently mollified, she sat back down and continued talking. "That night, Parker, you cannot imagine how terrible it was. Joseph began screaming like he was being murdered barely an hour after we put him to bed, and when we went to check on him, he told us that a giant bug had got hold of his head with its pincers and was running its claws over him. His blade clothes didn't show any signs of damage, and his face was completely unharmed, so we chalked it up to a nightmare from being in a new room. We thought it would go away after that night, but it didn't. It kept happening." She took another sip of her drink, and this time it was longer and more pained. We tried everything, she said, sounding helpless. We set traps near the wall he said it came from, but they were never sprung when he started screaming, and nothing as big as he described could have avoided it. Then my husband got in a sculptor to make that thing you saw when we first walked in, but that didn't do any good either. Eventually, we decided that perhaps Joe was seeing insects around the house, and they were triggering the problem, because he was so terrified of insects that just the sight of one would send him into hysterics. So we hired an exterminator as a live-in servant and asked him to go over the house every day to kill any bugs that crawled in. Nothing worked. The night terrors just kept happening. Martha drained more of the drink. Charles was insistent that he would get over it eventually, that all little boys have recurring nightmares or boogeymen of some kind, and that this was no different. He worried that bringing Joe to a mental ward might affect his chances at getting into a good grade school. But after 3 years of it, I could bear it no longer and brought him into you. She finished the last of the drink and, clearly wanting to maintain her composure, refilled it very quickly. I didn't interrupt. I sensed this was a story that it was taking all of her to get out. When he came out of dear old Thomas A.'s office, Parker, you would not believe that little boy had ever been scared of anything, she said softly. He kept excitedly telling us on the way home that he wasn't scared of the monster anymore, that he was brave now, and that the monster was just him scaring himself. I'm not scared of me, Mommy, so I can't be scared of it. The wizard in the castle for sad people said so. That's what he kept repeating. She put one hand to her mouth, and I could see tears start to well up in her eyes. She took another sip of her drink. We tried to give him the sedatives that night, but he kept insisting he wouldn't need them. He said he wanted to confront the monster and let it know it couldn't scare him any more. And when he didn't make a sound that night, we assumed whatever the doctor had told him must have done its work. Then, the next morning, we found Joseph squatting in the corner making these awful noises and leering at us. We haven't seen him since. I shuddered. It was inconclusive as far as my theory, but hearing it described in such grim detail only drove home the tragedy of whatever had happened to Joe. Still, I had to make sure my theory was correct, so I pushed forward with what I'd come there to ask. Martha, I have a favor to ask you. It may help with Joe's treatment. She nodded fiercely as she drained the rest of her glass almost in one gulp. Yes, she said, anything. We think Joe might have gotten the idea that rather than the monster being his imagination, part of him was the monster. I said slowly, making sure to sugarcoat the situation. That means we need to know as much as we can about its origins. In one of the tapes we have of Joe's therapy sessions, he says that the monster came out of the wall. If you don't mind, I'd like to see his room, and with your permission, I'd like to examine some of that wall to see if there's anything strange about it. Perhaps evidence of an infestation that your exterminator may have missed. Martha didn't seem to need time to consider. She stood up immediately and began to cross out of the room. Seeing that I hadn't moved, she jerked her head impatiently. Well, what are you waiting for? She asked. Of course, the answer is yes. Now come on, keep up. I'll have our handyman fetch you some tools. I was going to object that I'd brought my own, but seeing as I'd left them in the car, that seemed a pointless distraction. Besides, a place like this could probably afford much better materials for knocking down a wall than I could. So instead, I stood up and followed Martha M. out of the room and up several flights of stairs to Joe's old attic room. It was obvious, as soon as I walked in, that the room hadn't been lived in or even entered in quite some time. Dust caked all the surfaces, and some of the old toys in the room looked like they'd rusted. Even so, I could tell from looking around that it was a room that should have been able to put even the most nervous child at ease. Toys were scattered everywhere, ranging from action figures to stuffed animals to expansive model train tracks that ran the length of the room. The walls were painted a deep, relaxing blue, except on one side, where a massive, hyper-realistic mural of a bright red race car had been painted in painstaking detail. The bed looked less like a bed and more like a cloud given physical form, so covered was it in pillows and thick downy sheets. And the floor, unlike the rest of the house, was not hardwood, but was instead covered in lush, soft carpeting of the same soothing blue as the rest of the room. Nevertheless, Martha hesitated on the threshold of the room, as if the sight of it alone shook her resolve. Then, a steely look entering her eyes, she walked in and beckoned me toward a roughly 10-foot-long expanse of wall immediately to the left of the bed. She pointed at it with a disgusted look on her face.
"This is where Joseph said the thing would come from,"
she said bitterly. "Rankly impossible, of course. Even if I believed his monster could exist, it couldn't hide here. This is one of the outermost walls of this part of the house. There's nothing on the other side but open air, not even a small crawl space." She seemed to be talking less to me at this point and more to herself, as if trying to convince herself of her own sanity. Then, meeting my eyes, she spoke more directly. "The handyman should be up in a few minutes," she said bluntly. "I'll have him wait just down the hall until you've finished. Kindly let him know once your investigation is concluded, so he can fix any damage you do to the room. I hope you find what you're looking for." "Thank you, Martha," I said. She nodded stiffly but graciously, then swept out of the room. As promised, a few minutes later, a sour-faced, big man arrived, bearing a heavy bag of tools and even a large fire axe, which he thrust at me with a grunt before stomping off down the hall. I called a thank you at his back, but he didn't react. And now there was nothing else to do but investigate the room. Reasoning that I should look for some more mundane clues that might explain any part of Joe's psychosis before resorting to knocking down the wall, I started going through the seemingly endless supplies of toys, games, and books in the room. Yet aside from the obvious absence of anything that bore even faintly insect-like creatures, or that touched on subjects related to insects, I found nothing. Aside from how numerous they were, there was nothing remarkable about Joe's personal effects. These were just the sort of things you'd expect to see in a wealthy child's room. There was nothing else to do but to investigate the wall, then. Deciding I didn't want to go full Shining on it until I'd exhausted more subtle methods, and hoping I wouldn't have to at all, I first started by tapping on it with a hammer, trying to see if I could find any spot that sounded hollow. No luck. The wall seemed to be solid straight through, and if that was true, tearing it down might not reveal anything. It might just be wasting my time. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. Deciding I wanted to see if the wall was the same material strength straight through, I pulled out a power drill and fitted it with the longest bit I could find. Then I flicked it on and, bracing myself, pushed the drill into the wood. It splintered and cracked as I worked and was hard enough to sullenly defy the drill even against considerable force. But ultimately I was able to force the bit through until I met no resistance at all. The wall was the same, all the way through. Sighing with equal parts annoyance and relief, I moved to put the drill back when something almost imperceptible caught my eye. As I said before, the floor was covered in carpeting of the same color as the walls. However, near Joe's old bed, there were 2 areas where the carpet looked slightly uneven. Puzzled, and wondering if it was a trick of the light, I reached out to feel the disturbances, only to find that the carpet had been partially ripped up from the floor in both cases, only to be imperfectly, set back in place. Intrigued, I pulled at what seemed to be the origin point of the rip, and a long stretch of the carpet came loose from the floor, sliding back as easily as if I were pulling up a bedsheet. It was then that I noticed that the floor underneath, rather than made of the same hardwood mahogany as the other parts of the house, was instead made of some sort of lighter-colored, more modest hardwood that the carpet had clearly been intended to conceal. I mention this because it was only due to the light color of that wood that I was able to spot something that would have otherwise eluded my vision. A trail of small brown stains that followed the same trajectory as the ripped-up carpet and stopped at the solid wall behind me. If I'd had any doubts as to what these were, it was immediately destroyed by my discovery of a few small shards of hard material near the foot of the bed, which my medical education immediately identified as a child-sized human fingernails. Someone had been clinging onto the carpet so hard that their fingernails had been ripped out, and the carpet itself torn up, leaving a trail of blood that stopped at the wall. Now I knew I had no choice but to assail that wall. I grabbed the fire axe and began my attack, pouring every ounce of strength my muscles could produce into each swing. Once more the wall put up resistance, but the sharpness of the blade and the desperation of my assault pushed through easily, and a chunk of the wall came loose. As it did, it disclosed the mind-freezing horror that made me wonder if I had either already lost my mind or was about to lose it. Inside the wall, with the wood sculpted around it so perfectly that it looked as if it had been carved in place, was a tiny, child-sized, human skull. Already horrified, I had to duck away from the wall and cover my mouth to keep from retching, as the smell of 20 years of decomposition, hidden by that carved-out tomb, assailed my nose. Worse still was the incredulity I felt. What I was smelling and seeing seemed impossible. There was no way that anyone would have carved an alcove that perfectly sized to fit a child's corpse into the middle of a solid wall, particularly one that you'd have to knock down to even find. There was no point, no purpose. Then, in a sudden cataclysm of horror, it all came together. First, the words Joe had said to his mother after his first hospital visit. "I'm not scared of me, Mommy, so I can't be scared of it. The wizard in the castle for sad people said so." Then the first clue that had guided Dr. A to his diagnosis. I worked out why his delusions kept changing. They shift every time someone calls him a new nasty name. And finally, Joe's awful, innocent, prophetic words from the audio tape. It goes back in the walls when they come. It melts like ice cream. It looks like it is the wall. I'm going to tell you that it doesn't scare me the next time I see it. The rush of thoughts that blasted my mind then were so terrible that I couldn't help screaming aloud, because in that instant I knew what had happened had been far worse than either I or Dr. A had speculated. The real Joe M. had been dead ever since the night after his first return from the hospital. He'd been suffocated to death in a tomb created by hands that could melt through a solid wall. The hands of the thing that had tormented him. And then, having been told that it was Joe, the monster, living off his fear and suffering, had assumed his form and proceeded to the all-it-could-eat buffet that was our castle for sad people. There it had tormented 2 decades' worth of unsuspecting mental patients and doctors. It had grown fat on years of bad thoughts that it had barely had to work to produce. And with every attempt we made to cure that unnamed malevolent parasite, we had sent it a new victim. If I had had any faith in the ultimate curative powers of science and medicine remaining before then, that revelation destroyed it. But painful as that feeling was, it also brought a sort of cold clarity. I knew what I would have to do. Firstly, I would have to alert Martha M. as to what I had found, and then I would have to find a way to get justice for the poor murdered boy whose corpse I had just disinterred. I picked up the fire axe again and was about to knock away the bits of the wall covering the rest of my 6-year-old Joe's hidden body when Martha came running into the room. I suppose in retrospect my scream must have made her wonder what had happened. When she looked at the wall, I think her mind must have at first refused to accept what was there, for all she could do was stare, with wide, uncomprehending eyes, at the child-sized skeleton that had been entombed in that cursed room for so long. When she finally broke eye contact with it, it was to look up at me with a childlike, pleading look that seemed to implore me, the doctor, to provide a rational explanation. "Dr. H," she whimpered, "what is the meaning of this?" I couldn't even begin to formulate an answer, so I didn't even try. Instead, I replied with a question of my own. "Mrs. M., may I keep that fire axe?" Still looking at me with a mixture of fear and incomprehension, she slowly nodded.